Imagine a man who believed himself a god, who was worshipped as divine by millions, whose conquests had reshaped the known world. Alexander the Great, the legendary conqueror, stood at the zenith of human power, his empire stretching from Greece to India, his very name synonymous with invincibility. Yet, in the scorching summer of 323 BC, in the ancient, sweltering city of Babylon, this colossus of history was about to face an enemy he could not conquer, his own mortality. The conventional narrative often glosses over Alexander's final days, presenting a swift, almost clinical end to a meteoric life. But the truth, as always, is far more visceral, agonizing, and shrouded in a perplexing mystery that has captivated historians and medical experts for millennia. His death was not a serene departure, but a slow, brutal siege upon his body and mind, leaving behind a power vacuum that would plunge the world into generations of bloody conflict. To truly understand the end of Alexander, we must strip away the myths and step into the suffocating heat of Babylon, into the fetid royal palace, and witness the agonizing unraveling of a legend. By June of 323 BC, Alexander was back in Babylon, the heart of his sprawling empire, after years of relentless campaigning. He was still relatively young, only 32 years old, but the wear and tear of a decade of constant warfare, wounds, excessive drinking, and perhaps a casual disregard for his own physical limits had taken their toll. The air in Babylon, especially in early summer, was thick, humid, and heavy with the smells of a bustling ancient metropolis. Spices, sweat, animal dung, and the ever-present stench of the Euphrates. The city itself was a breeding ground for disease, a labyrinth of canals and crowded dwellings, perfect for harboring any number of pathogens. On the evening of the 2nd of June, Alexander reportedly attended a lavish banquet hosted by his admiral Nearchus. The celebrations, as was typical for Alexander, were extravagant, fueled by copious amounts of unmixed wine, a potent brew by Greek standards. He was known for his legendary capacity for alcohol, often engaging in drinking contests that would fell lesser men. That night, according to some accounts, he continued the revelry at a secondary party, perhaps at the house of Medius of Larissa, one of his companions. It was after this last epic indulgence that the first tremors of his demise began. He woke the following morning, the 3rd of June, not with a mere hangover, but with a burning fever, shivering tremors, and a profound, debilitating exhaustion. The initial symptoms were likely dismissed as the inevitable consequence of his excesses. Alexander, after all, was no stranger to discomfort. He had endured arrows through his leg, a javelin through his lung, and countless minor wounds. He had marched thousands of miles through deserts and mountains. A fever was, surely, just a passing inconvenience. But this was different. The fever persisted, growing more intense with each passing hour. His body, once a finely honed instrument of war, began to betray him. The ancient accounts, though varying in detail and reliability, paint a consistent picture of a rapid decline. His fever climbed, his strength ebbed, and a gnawing pain began to consume him. Sleep offered no respite, only vivid, fever-induced hallucinations that blurred the line between waking and dreaming. As the days bled into one another, Alexander's condition worsened dramatically. The royal journals, a kind of official court diary, reportedly documented his symptoms meticulously, though these records are now lost and known only through later historians like Arrian and Plutarch. They speak of an insatiable thirst, a hallmark symptom of many severe fevers. Imagine the conqueror of empires, reduced to begging for water, his throat parched, his tongue swollen, his body convulsing with chills. His voice, usually booming with command, grew hoarse, then faint. He found it increasingly difficult to speak, his words slurring, his mind drifting in and out of lucidity. The pain, once localized, seemed to spread, encompassing his entire being. He was tormented by restlessness, unable to find a comfortable position, constantly shifting in his bed as the fever consumed him. The atmosphere in the royal palace, usually vibrant with political intrigue and military planning, turned somber, hushed, thick with foreboding. His closest companions, the formidable generals known as the Diadochi, who would later tear his empire apart in their struggles for power, now stood helplessly by his bedside. Perdiccas, Craterus, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, these men, who had faced down Persian armies and wild beasts alongside Alexander, could do nothing but watch. They summoned the most skilled physicians of the age, but ancient medicine, for all its wisdom in certain areas, was ill-equipped to combat such a ferocious, systemic illness. Their remedies, purges, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, were more likely to weaken Alexander further than to aid him. Each day brought a new, more alarming symptom. On the 4th of June, the fever intensified. By the 5th of June, he could barely move from his bed. On the 6th of June, the symptoms grew so severe that he was moved to a cooler chamber, perhaps in a vain attempt to break the fever. His general, Pithon, was sent to the temple of Serapis to consult the oracle, an act of desperation signifying the profound fear that gripped the court. The oracle was asked if it would be better for Alexander to be brought to the temple. The answer was a grim negative. It would be better for him to remain where he was. It was a subtle, yet chilling sign that the end was near. The smell in the room must have been unbearable. The human body, when suffering from extreme fever and illness, can emit a sickly sweet, putrid odor. Combine that with the lack of proper sanitation in an ancient palace, and the scene becomes truly unsettling. Attendants would have constantly wiped his brow, changed sweat-soaked linens, and tried to ease his discomfort. But the sheer physical degeneration was relentless. By the 8th of June, Alexander was too weak to even offer a hand to his officers. His men, hearing of his worsening condition, grew increasingly alarmed. The fear that their god-king, their invincible leader, might be dying, sparked a wave of panic and despair. They demanded to see him, to pay their last respects to the man who had led them to unprecedented glory. What followed was one of the most poignant and heartbreaking scenes in Alexander's final days. The guards, recognizing the gravity of the situation, allowed the soldiers to file past his bed. Imagine the sight. Thousands of hardened veterans, men who had faced down elephants and chariots without flinching, now walking slowly, reverently past their dying commander. He lay there, ravaged by disease, his once magnificent body a skeletal wreck, his eyes barely open, but he reportedly still managed to acknowledge each man, a faint nod or a blink, a final, silent farewell to the army he had forged into an unstoppable force. It was a grotesque tableau, the silent procession of living legends witnessing the slow, agonizing death of their greatest legend. By the 9th of June, Alexander was completely unresponsive. He had lost the ability to speak, his breathing shallow and labored. The only sound in the room would have been the ragged gasps of a dying man and the hushed whispers of his terrified companions. The question of succession, once a distant abstraction, now loomed like a predatory beast, casting a long, dark shadow over the dying king. The empire, forged by his singular will, teetered on the brink of fracture. On the 10th of June, 323 BC, Alexander the Great, the Conqueror, the divine king, finally succumbed. His last breath was drawn in the suffocating heat of Babylon, leaving behind a silence more deafening than any roar of battle. The moment of death, however, did not bring clarity. It ushered in an era of profound confusion and bitter controversy. The mystery of his illness, the swiftness of his decline, and the lack of any obvious cause immediately fueled speculation. Was it merely disease, or was something far more sinister at play? Theories of Alexander's death can broadly be divided into two camps: natural causes and poisoning. Both have compelling arguments and significant historical support, yet neither provides a definitive, undisputed answer, contributing to the enduring agony of the mystery. Let's first delve into the realm of natural causes. Modern medical experts, leveraging ancient descriptions of symptoms and modern understanding of epidemiology, have proposed a dizzying array of possibilities. Perhaps the most frequently cited candidate is malaria. Alexander had campaigned extensively in marshy, mosquito-ridden regions, particularly in India and Mesopotamia, where malaria was endemic. The symptoms described, intermittent fevers, shivering chills, drenching sweats, intense thirst, are all consistent with a severe malarial infection, particularly Plasmodium falciparum. which can lead to cerebral malaria and rapid deterioration. The cyclical nature of malaria might explain periods of lucidity interspersed with delirium. The long journey back to Babylon, with its exhausting marches and exposure, would have left Alexander immunocompromised and vulnerable. Another strong contender is typhoid fever, caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi. Typhoid is transmitted through contaminated food and water, a pervasive risk in ancient cities like Babylon. Its symptoms include a high, persistent fever, extreme fatigue, abdominal pain, diarrhea or constipation, and, in severe cases, delirium, rose spots on the skin, and internal hemorrhaging or perforation of the bowel. The accounts of Alexander's protracted fever and eventual collapse align well with the progression of untreated typhoid. The intense thirst and the eventual inability to speak could be due to severe dehydration and toxemia. West Nile virus has also been proposed. This mosquito-borne illness can cause severe neurological symptoms, including encephalitis, which could explain the delirium, confusion, and eventual coma. However, while fevers and headaches are common, the rapid onset of debilitating physical symptoms described in Alexander's case might be less typical of West Nile, without a pre-existing vulnerability. Other hypotheses include acute pancreatitis, perhaps triggered or exacerbated by his heavy drinking. Symptoms would include severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and fever. This could explain the profound pain and rapid decline. Given Alexander's known alcoholic tendencies, this is a plausible, albeit less common, cause for such a severe terminal illness in a young man. Peritonitis from a perforated ulcer or appendix is another possibility, which would lead to excruciating abdominal pain, fever, and sepsis. However, the ancient accounts don't explicitly mention the acute localized abdominal pain that would characterize such an event, though the general pain could encompass it. Finally, a generalized tuplang sepsis resulting from an infection of a past wound or a recurring illness is plausible. Alexander had suffered numerous serious injuries throughout his campaigns. A festering, unhealed wound, even a seemingly minor one, could have become infected and led to systemic blood poisoning, a fatal condition even with modern medicine, let alone in the ancient world. The lack of antibiotics meant that even a simple infection could spiral into a deadly one. What unites these natural cause theories is the reality of ancient life. Hygiene was rudimentary, medical knowledge limited, and exposure to pathogens constant. A man who had pushed his body to its absolute limits for years, marching through diverse climates and consuming varied diets, was inherently susceptible to disease. The combination of chronic exhaustion, perhaps underlying alcohol-induced liver damage, and a sudden, virulent infection could easily have brought down even the most robust individual. The sheer physical agony described could be attributed to the body's desperate fight against a relentless pathogen. But the story of Alexander's death doesn't end with medical conjecture. It veers sharply into the labyrinthine world of ancient political intrigue and the chilling whispers of poison. The immediate aftermath of his death was a scene of chaos and profound suspicion. His body remained unburied for several days, perhaps due to the sudden onset of his illness preventing preparations, or perhaps due to the intense political maneuvering among his generals. Ancient accounts often describe the body remaining remarkably fresh, defying the rapid decomposition expected in the Babylonian heat, a detail some have interpreted as evidence of poisoning, specifically a slow-acting poison that also had preservative qualities. However, this could also be a myth perpetuated for dramatic effect or a misinterpretation of events. The poison theory gained traction almost immediately after Alexander's death. Why? Because the stakes were extraordinarily high. With Alexander gone, the vast empire he had created was suddenly up for grabs. Numerous individuals stood to gain immensely from his demise, and many more had reasons to resent or fear him. Let's consider the motives. 1. The Diadochi ***. While publicly grieving, these powerful generals had grown increasingly independent and ambitious. They had endured Alexander's increasingly erratic behavior, his demands for proskynesis, and his plans for further endless campaigns. Some, like Cassander, famously harbored a deep personal animosity towards Alexander. The opportunity to seize control of parts of the empire free from his overpowering will, would have been an irresistible temptation for some. 2. Antipater, asterisk, asterisk. The regent of Macedon, Antipater, had been a loyal but long-suffering subordinate. He had been effectively dismissed by Alexander, who intended to recall him to Babylon and send Craterus to Macedon in his place. Antipater had every reason to fear Alexander's wrath and potential execution. His sons, Cassander and Iolaus, were also implicated in some accounts. 3. Disgruntled Macedonians, asterisk, asterisk. Alexander's increasingly orientalized court, his adoption of Persian customs, and his mass marriages between his soldiers and Persian women had alienated many of his traditional Macedonian soldiers and officers. The mutiny at Opus, where soldiers openly rebelled against his policies, demonstrated the depth of their discontent. 4. Olympias, asterisk, asterisk, Alexander's mother. Olympias was a formidable and ruthless woman. She had a notoriously volatile relationship with Antipater and might have feared for her own position or safety if Antipater's influence grew. However, her involvement is highly speculative. Now, the alleged methods of poisoning. The most commonly cited source for the poison theory is the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, who, while prone to dramatic embellishment, drew from earlier, now lost, Greek sources. He describes a slow-acting poison, prepared by Antipater and administered by his son Iolaus, Alexander's cupbearer, possibly at the banquet with Medius. What kind of poison could fit the description? Asterisk, hellebore. Asterisk, asterisk. This highly toxic plant, particularly the white hellebore, produces symptoms that remarkably align with Alexander's described decline. Ingestion of white hellebore causes severe gastrointestinal distress, bradycardia, extreme weakness, muscle tremors, and eventually cardiac arrest. It can be slow-acting, taking several days to prove fatal, and the symptoms could easily be mistaken for a severe fever. It also has a bitter taste that could be masked in wine. The fact that Alexander reportedly complained of a sharp pain in his back after drinking the fateful cup and then began a slow, agonizing descent points to something introduced orally. Asterisk. Arsenic. Asterisk. Asterisk. Another possibility. Arsenic poisoning can also cause gastrointestinal upset, muscle cramps, and organ damage. It was known and used as a poison in the ancient world. However, the specific constellation of Alexander's symptoms, particularly the prolonged fever and thirst, might fit hellebore more closely. The problem with the poison theory is the lack of irrefutable evidence. No autopsy was performed. The ancient world had no forensic science. The royal journals, which might have shed light on the specifics, are lost. Later, historians often relied on rumor, hearsay, and political agendas. Curtius Rufus wrote centuries after the events, and his accounts are often seen as less reliable than contemporaries like Arrian. Yet, the persistent whispers, the motives, and the circumstantial evidence make it a compelling and deeply unsettling possibility. Consider the political fallout. If Alexander was poisoned, who would dare admit it? His generals, squabbling over his empire, would have no interest in investigating a crime that might implicate one of their own, or even themselves. It was far more convenient to let the narrative of a natural, albeit mysterious, death stand. The truth, if it involved assassination, would have been buried deep beneath layers of political expediency and the fog of war. The very mystery of Alexander's death only compounds the agony of his final days. Was he merely a victim of the microbial world, an unwitting host to a common pathogen? Or was he the target of a meticulous, slow-acting assassination, a brutal coup de grace delivered by those closest to him? The physical agony he endured, the burning fever, the thirst, the hallucinations, the growing weakness, would have been compounded by a psychological agony, the realization that his legendary body was failing him, that his reign was ending, that his grand plans for further conquest would never be realized. Imagine the frustration, the rage. 3 E. Despair of Alexander as he lay there. A man who had commanded armies, humbled kings, and tamed wild lands, now utterly helpless, enslaved by an invisible enemy within. He who had overcome every obstacle was now staring into the abyss of his own mortality, stripped of his power, his dignity, and ultimately his breath. The Conqueror, conquered by a microscopic foe, or perhaps even more chillingly, by the very ambition and fear he inspired in his closest allies. Even after his death, the drama surrounding Alexander's body continued. His generals squabbled over his remains, seeing possession of his corpse as a symbol of legitimacy. Ptolemy, who would establish the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, ultimately hijacked the funeral cortege and brought Alexander's body to Memphis and later to Alexandria, where it was interred in a magnificent tomb. This act further highlights the immense symbolic power Alexander wielded, even in death, and the desperate scramble for his legacy. The impact of Alexander's death reverberated for centuries. It shattered the nascent empire, leading to the Wars of the Diadochi, a brutal half-century of conflict that saw his generals carve up his conquests into Hellenistic kingdoms. The political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East was irrevocably altered. Cities bearing his name, Alexandria chief among them, became centers of Hellenistic culture and learning, enduring monuments to his vision. But the cost was immense. Countless lives lost in the ensuing power struggles, and the fragmentation of a unified vision that might have reshaped the world in unforeseen ways. Alexander's death, whether by natural illness or by poison, serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of even the greatest power. He was a force of nature, a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader who believed himself touched by the divine. Yet, he was ultimately flesh and blood, susceptible to the same maladies and machinations that afflict all mortals. His agony in Babylon was a profoundly human drama, a final, visceral testament to the fact that no amount of power, glory, or divine aspiration can cheat the grave. The enduring mystery of his demise continues to fascinate because it speaks to deeper anxieties: the fear of unseen enemies, the vulnerability of the mighty, and the limits of human knowledge. We crave a definitive answer, a clean medical diagnosis, or a clear perpetrator, to bring closure to such an extraordinary life. But history, in its rawest form, often denies us such neat conclusions. Instead, it offers a tangled web of symptoms, suspicions, and political expediency. So, when we remember Alexander the Great, let us not only envision the triumphant conqueror on horseback, but also the dying man in Babylon, ravaged by fever, gasping for air, his once invincible body betraying him, surrounded by whispers of disease and conspiracy. His death was not just an event. It was a profound, agonizing climax to a life lived at impossible speeds, a final, chilling human reality that underscores the ultimate dominion of mortality over even the most colossal ambitions. And in that raw, unsettling reality, we find not a sanitized hero, but a man-immortal whose legend, in its final moments, was far more complex and far more terrifying than any tale of conquest could convey.